Hi everybody. We pick back up in our study in the book of Acts in Acts 27. We've seen in the past few weeks Paul arrested, Paul slanderously charged with insurrection and accused, and we've seen him present his defense to several rulers, all of whom have been unwilling or unable to hear the case properly. We've seen an attempt on his life, and so Paul has appealed to Caesar. And today we're going to see the journey begin that's going to actually take Paul to Rome to present his argument before Caesar. And we're going to see the series of events, the protection of God, the sovereignty of God, everything working according to the plan of God to put Paul exactly where he needs to be for exactly what purpose God has in mind for him. So let's see what Luke tells us this week. So we start right in verse 1. Now, throughout the book of Acts, in the experience of Paul, anything after about Acts 12, you see Luke, the narrator, shift every so often from we to they. Because sometimes Luke was with Paul and his companions, and when he was with them, he says, we did this or we went there. And other times he was not with them, and so he's recording what happened in his absence, and he says they. Luke is with Paul in these experiences that he's writing about, and so he says, and when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, that is, it's time to go. This would depend on the weather. This would depend on the schedule of the military. Paul was he was a prisoner, but not a terribly important prisoner. They're not going to make a special trip. In fact, we're going to see him moving with a military unit along with other prisoners as well. And they're going to hire their passage on a cargo ship. So he's just had to wait for all of this to be arranged, and the time has come. And so they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius. He is a centurion of the Augustan regiment. Now, Luke is a historian, and Luke was there, and he provides us with as much detail as he possibly can because he wants to validate the truth of these events. This isn't a myth. This isn't something that has been fabricated. These are real events that really happened, and he can tell you when and where and who, and so he gives us this name Julius. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. They knew the way to go, and if they kept the land on the left side, then they're just traveling south, and they would be not too far out to sea, not to get lost. They would be able to pull into ports and harbors. This practice was pretty common and is followed even today. So this is supposed to be just a safe trip. They're just going to sail along the coast. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. We see Aristarchus appear in a couple of Paul's epistles. The next day we landed at Sidon. So one day down, it says, and Julius was kind to Paul and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. He allows Paul to leave the boat in Sidon when they get into port, to see people he knows, to be fed, perhaps to receive some medicine or clothing or other things that Paul may need. So we're going to see that Paul's built an ally here in Julius, and that's going to play out through Acts 27. And the first example of his kindness here is that Paul allowed him to go and see his friends. Picking up in verse 4, when we had put out to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus. Now, when he says under the shelter of Cyprus, he's speaking the way the nautical people would speak. And so when you have wind and the tides and the currents, the movement of the ocean, an island like Cyprus is a feature that can help you to navigate. And in our world, we speak of the windward side and the leeward side. And the side that of an island that is receiving the wind and waves is the windward side, but the other side of that is much calmer, the leeward side. And so when he says we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, what he means is we use this island to buffer us from some of the bad weather, which is going to be a factor as the story moves on. He says because the winds were against us. So he's in his attempt to explain and to validate the historicity of these events, he's giving us minor details that might seem insignificant. The point of this is to make sure that his readers know he was there, he saw it, eyewitness to these events. And he says, and when we sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. Very detailed. We arrived at this port. And he says, and there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. So the officer went around and found a ship. This is an Egyptian ship from Alexandria in Egypt, and it was headed from Myra to Italy. It was probably running a route hauling cargo, and so they hired passage on the ship so they could move the soldiers and the prisoners to Rome. And I would add that in the era we're talking about, Egypt was part of the Roman Empire, so there's really no political or military significance. He's just pointing out the origin of the ship because that's historical detail. Verse 7, and when we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off of Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off of Salome. So the weather is against them. The waves are against them. The wind is against them. It's slow going. They're having a hard time. The goal is to simply make their way along to Italy, but the weather is not permitting them to proceed. They sail under Crete, that is the leeward side of that, passing it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens. What a wonderful harbor that must have been. They named it Fair Havens because it was calm in the midst of storm. And he says it was near the city of Lycia. Now, when much time had been spent, and sailing was dangerous because the fast was already over. That is, we've gotten into the winter time. We've gotten into late fall, nearly winter, and all the good weather of spring and summer has passed. And now this is not a good season to be out on the ocean. Paul advised them and said, men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. He speaks, and we're not told initially the origin of this knowledge Paul has. He's very experienced as a traveler. He's been all over the world, but there's also a spiritual element as well. We're going to find that he's receiving revelation from God as he goes along. And so he's advising them, let's not go. This is going to be really bad. We're going to lose the ship, you're going to lose the cargo, and we're all going to lose our lives if we sail out into the weather. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. Now, the helmsman would be the captain of the boat. He would be the one who's actually responsible for the operation of the ship. It's his job to know what his boat can do and how to do it, and he evaluates everything, and he says, I think we can make it. The owner of the ship, who has an interest in earning a profit from the ship, and also an interest in preserving the ship, because it's not profitable if it sinks, they both examine all the information they have available to them, and they determine they can go. They don't want to die, and they don't want to lose the boat, but they think they can make it, and so they're going to go for it. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. That is, the harbor's on the leeward side of the island. And so when the weather gets really, really bad, they get the least of it, and it's a pretty good harbor. So what they've decided is they're going to have to winter the boat over. They're going to have to park it somewhere for a few months to wait for the weather to improve. This was not unusual in that time. That's why it just took forever to get anywhere. But the harbor they're in is not good enough, so they're going to make a run for Crete, for the Phoenix harbor, and try to make that before the weather hits. So let's see what happens. Picking up in verse. When the south wind blew softly, supposing they had obtained their desire. Now they're headed north, and here is this soft, gentle breeze coming up from the south, which is exactly what they need to push their boat on up. This is great. This is just what they could hope for, supposing that they had obtained their desire. This is just what they wanted. The weather's good. We're going to make a run for it. We've got a window of opportunity. They put out to sea, and they sailed close by Crete. But not long after they get out in the open, a tempestuous headwind arose, which they called Euroclydon. Sailors have always named storms. Like here in America, we might hear about a nor'easter, and it's a reference to the way the wind is headed, and some are worse than others. And here comes this Euroclydon coming right out of Europe to the south, and it's a headwind, and it's pushing them back south. And the ship was caught and could not head into the wind. There was just no way to tack this boat to make way. And sometimes they can do that. If they're good, there's a way to arrange the sails where you're moving forward into the wind. It's remarkable what they figured out how to do. But there was no way to do that here. And they didn't have any option but to just let her drive. And what that means is, rather than fight the weather, they're just going to allow her to be pushed on south. Now, this should hold up their arrival, but their goal is going to be to continue to be able to navigate and know where they are, probably by staying close by Crete. As long as they can see the shore, they know where they are. But they certainly aren't getting the weather they had hoped they would get. Watch what happens here. The south wind blew softly. Paul has spoken. We're going to find in a moment the knowledge and wisdom he had was from the Holy Spirit, but the helmsman and the owner of the boat prevailed, and then there's this south wind softly. The circumstances look right, but God has spoken, and he said no, and they're going on anyway. And we can apply this to our lives and say, sometimes we get this revelation from God, we get this word of God in our lives, and then we get this south wind that lures us into disobedience. And the result of that is usually what it's going to be here, spiritual shipwreck. So let's pick up in verse 16. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. That is, they're on a big boat. Lots of people, hundreds of people on this big boat. And they would have behind it a skiff, a lifeboat, John boat, sort of a boat that they would pull along behind them that would allow them to go to shore or over to another boat, or it was just handy to move around in. And he said it was hard to secure it because it was tossed around so much. We were afraid we were going to lose that boat we were towing. So they brought it on board, had to bring the skiff up onto the boat, and then he says they use cables, ropes, to undergird the ship. That is, to make sure it held together, they would pass the ropes under the hull and around onto the top of the boat, just to tie it together, just to make it that much stronger. And fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck their sails and were driven. Now this is the worst thing almost the worst thing that could happen on a boat in ancient times, because the the thing that allowed people to sail all over the world was navigation. You had to know where you were, you had to know where you were going. They relied on the stars to do that. But more than anything, they relied on familiarity with the area. And so they would want to stay within sight of the shore, so they know they're not out in the middle of the ocean. And they would want to know where they were. They would do their best to follow themselves on a chart they had made. The worst thing that could happen was that you ended up in a storm, pushed all around, and you end up, when the storm is over, you don't know where you are. Well, if you don't know where you are, you don't know which way to go to get to land. And you could be not too far away from a port, but if you sail the other way, you just end up out at sea and you perish for lack of water, food, that sort of thing. So to just allow yourself to just be driven by the wind was the last thing they wanted to do. But their fear was, if they didn't, if they attempted to stay close to shore, they were going to end up shipwrecked on the beach or on this sandbar. So things are getting really, really bad. It's a rough storm. They should not have gone out in it. How bad is it? Because we were exceedingly tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. Now, what do they have on it? They have cargo to sell. Um, when they pitch cargo into the ocean, it means they lose all chance of earning a profit off of it. And that's the last thing you want to do. But if the boat's too heavy and they fear it's going to sink, they have to reduce the weight, and they are so desperate that they're not about making a profit anymore. They're just about staying alive. And so they lightened the ship. The third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now, a boat this big would be operated by ropes and sails and winches and all sorts of hardware. And without all of that hardware, it'd be very hard to control and steer the boat. They're so desperate to stay alive, they're not even worried about steering anymore. And so they pitched all this hardware overboard as well. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, they lose their ability to monitor the passage of time, which is necessary for estimating speed, and they lose their ability to know the direction they're traveling in, because they have no sun and they have no stars. So they have lost all possibility of having any idea where they are. They're just hurtling through the ocean in the dark for 3 days. All hope that we would be saved was finally given up. They have no reason to believe that they're going to come out of this alive, because even if the storm doesn't sink the ship, who knows where they are, and who knows if they'll ever make it home. So they abandon hope because of the darkness and the wind, and they detach themselves from their hardware and their cargo. They're to the point where the only thing that matters to them is just staying alive. They're desperate. And then we're going to hear Paul speak in the midst of that. We pick up in verse 21. After a long abstinence from food, we're going to see in a moment they haven't eaten in 14 days. That's how bad this storm was. Paul stood in the midst of them and said, I told you so. He said, men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. But his point isn't to say, I told you so. His point is to encourage them. But now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. He says, we're going to make it out of this alive. We're all going to live. We're going to lose the ship. But here's how you can know that. Here's why you should have listened to me to begin with. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. Now remember, the soldiers with them are from Italy, from Rome primarily. The sailors are Egyptian. These aren't people who worship the God of Israel, so he has to speak to them in a way that they're going to understand. The God whom I serve. And said, don't be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed, he says, the God has given you all those who sail with you. The plan and the purpose of God is not going to be stopped by this storm. God's plan and purpose is for Paul to bear witness to his faith before Caesar, and that doesn't happen if he dies in the ocean and goes to heaven. So God's plan will prevail, and he says, furthermore, I've given you all these men. They will live with you. Therefore, men, take heart, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. So he's bearing witness. I got a revelation from God. I trust God. I believe him. However, we must run aground on a certain island. He says, you can know I'm right because we're going to be shipwrecked on an island, which for them is good news if it's a friendly island, because that's where water and food are. So he has received a message from God. An angel of the Lord stood by him and said, my plan will prevail. You will go to Rome. You will witness before Caesar, and all of the men with you will survive. You'll lose the boat in the shipwreck. Verse 27. Now when the 14th night had come, they've been in this storm for 2 weeks. He says, as we were driven up and down the Adriatic Sea. They are everywhere. About midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near land. They sensed it, or they smelled it, or something about the feel of the ocean. They're sailors. They know their craft. So they get the idea we're near land, and they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they'd gone a little farther, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Well, what they would do is they had a rope with knots in it, and you put a weight on the end of that, and you lowered it till it hit the bottom, and you counted how many knots it was, and the depth was standardized, and so you could see how near you were to land, or at least how deep it was. And as they go along, it's getting shallower, so they realize they're near an island. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. If they could only see what was going on around them, then they'd know how to react. But they're afraid they're near an island with rocks out along the coast, and they're just going to be smashed into the rocks, and they're going to die in the darkness there. And so they put out 4 anchors to attempt to hold them off this island, and prayed for daylight. They're just going to hang on and pray for daylight. And I know you've been there, and I've been there, where everything seems so uncertain. And the only thing we feel sure about is that if things continue the way they're going, that we're not going to make it. And so when that happens, they hang on and they pray for day. And that's not a terrible perspective for us to have either. As the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, they wanted off this boat. We're not far from land. If we could go out in the skiff, if we could go out in the little boat, maybe we can make our way to shore and not be smashed up on the rocks out here in the big boat. So the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, the front of the boat. We're going to get in this small boat, sail around to the front, and put anchors out and pin down the front of the boat too. It was clear what they were up to, so Paul spoke to the centurion and to the soldiers. Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. We're all in this together. We're going to live together, or we're all going to die. And in response to this, the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall. They would rather lose the lifeboat than all die. This is a sign they trust Paul. Paul has known what's going on all along. He's received this vision from God. And so rather than allow the sailors to escape in the skiff, they cut the rope and let the skiff go. They're all in this together. And as day was about to dawn, remember, both Paul and Luke are Jews. For them, the day starts in the evening, so it's not about to be a new day. It's still day 14 for their minds. So Paul speaks, and he implored them all to take food, and said, "Today is the 14th day you've waited and continued without food and not eaten." They haven't eaten in 2 weeks. "Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival. Since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. You're going to live. You need to eat. You'll need your energy." And when he had said these things, he took bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and when he had broken it, he began to eat. In that he looks a lot like Jesus. He breaks the bread, he eats, he prays. He does that here in the presence of all these men on this boat, promising them they'll survive, encouraging them to maintain their energy and their strength. And I would just add a pastoral tone here. Sometimes we're going through painful experiences, difficult experiences, and we're going to make it. We're going to be okay. We all have, because God has protected and provided for us all along, and be it through the death of a loved one, or through the loss of a job, or through all the hardship that's gone along with the virus and the shutdown. Hard times. When we have a promise from God, we're going to make it and we're going to be okay. Then the priority we should have is to be prepared for God's salvation. He's going to preserve them. He's going to save them. So they should eat, so they'll have some energy, because they have to keep going. And so when we're living under the promise of God's protection and God's provision, we need to be prepared for Him to save us by watching out for the things that we need for our physical health, mental health, family health, all of that. When they saw Paul, when they heard Paul, they were encouraged, and they took food themselves. So in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. This was a big ship. Between the soldiers, the sailors, and the prisoners, it's a lot of people. When they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw the wheat into the sea. They ate all they could eat, and then threw the rest of their food overboard, just to reduce the weight of the boat to try to keep themselves alive. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but observed a bay with a beach, onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. This would be the best possible outcome, because if you could wash your boat up onto the sandy, soft beach, it might even be salvageable. And it has you right there at the shore, and so you're not likely to drown. Let's see if we can put this boat up on the beach. So it says they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. Not even worried about it. Don't even need those anymore. Let's just get this ship on land. And they loosed the rudder, the ropes. This would be their means of steering the ship. And they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. And so they're going to make one last run. But he says, striking a place where two seas met. And we're not sure what he means by that, other than the way he describes it. The violence of the waves. What he means is that this was a particularly rough spot there right off the shore. He says that they ran aground, and the prow, the front of the boat, stuck fast and remained immovable. but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. So the front is up on the beach, but the back end is really in violent waves, the surf. They're not safe yet, in other words. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. They are accountable with their lives to bring their prisoners to Rome. And it'd be better to bring the prisoner's body to Rome than to show up with no prisoners. And so to save their own skins, they're going to kill the prisoners. But Julius, the centurion, wanting to save Paul, he has a unique relationship with Paul, a respect for Paul. He wants to keep Paul alive. He kept them from their purpose, and he commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest on boards and on some parts of the ship. In other words, if you can swim, you just go and be out of the way, and we're going to pitch things over into the water that we're going to try to hang on to and make it to the shore. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. So they made it. Where are they? We're not sure yet, not told yet. Who will they meet there? What sort of people? How long will they be there? What effect will this have on the plan and purpose of God? None of that's told to us yet. That's what Acts 28 is about. But what we've seen this week is the Lord leading Paul, guiding Paul, taking Paul to Caesar, to Rome, and through the midst of the hardest circumstances Paul could imagine, that God has protected and provided for him. And you would think it couldn't get any worse, but tune in next week. It gets worse for Paul, but yet God protects and God provides and God leads. So we'll see next week how that plays out. Now, thank you so much for listening.